Hi, this is Sherry Enns, and I wanted to highlight a few key ideas moving forward in the textbook. And some of the ideas I've already asked you to explore included what were the main characteristics of the pre-industrial city. And you'll note in Joburg's model at the core of the pre-industrial city was royalty, elite, and that those that were less fortunate were pushed to the edges of the city. How did industrial capitalism affect the structure of the city? The Fortis city, which is discussed in a fair amount of detail, and then a little bit more on the impact of globalization. Again, not going through these in detail, but giving you the opportunity to click on links or copy and paste. And if they don't work, I guess you probably have enough information without most of the links. And just to really understand the generalized social geography of the pre-industrial city, and then how the city changed, and with industrialization, concepts about way of life. And I think most of us know what I'm referencing when I say the sort of Charles Dickens image of the industrial city and the reality for many people living at that time. As the city moved into industrialization, there were different periods or stages, and again, noting this is focusing more on Western modernization and less on what the pathway or what it's looked like in newly industrialized countries, or still yet in some people's frame of reference, newly yet to industrialized countries, although we could debate those terms. But I think my point here is that we're focusing on Europe and North America in this context. So you can see as the city moved through the industrialized period, the social geography changed with the approaches to technology as well as ideas about industry and development. And if you watch, copy and paste some of these links, you'll see that as the city became industrialized, the story for the most part was to get out of the city and move to the edge of the city. And there's a really powerful book titled Borderlands, which basically suggests that women and children were seen as best off outside of the city. So anyone with funding or money moved there. Although in some contexts, what we found happening, and as you look at the different neighborhoods and so on, such as Beacon Hill in Chicago, a little bit Shaughnessy in Vancouver, some of these more prestigious neighborhoods resisted change and downgrading that was taking place with industrialization. So I think what I would like you to be able to understand that we're doing a broad brush. So every city before industrialization had its own form and ideas, and it was shaped by technology, agriculture, organizing principles. For example, one of the organizing principles with the industrial city was health and the need to separate houses to have sanitation in order to protect from health issues. And some would suggest that the organizing principle now is crime, maybe even terrorism in that regard. But each city at each point in time often demonstrated comprehensive planning as well as ideas or ideals about where certain groups of people should live within the city. For example, the medieval city needed walls for defense. This is prior to other types of, I guess, ammunition. And in that regard, where if you lived in the center next to the church or the castle, most likely you were of a position of power, and if you were beyond the walls, then you were obviously in a situation where you were not protected. So as we move into the post-industrial city, or sorry, the industrial city, this begins to change with the more elite moving out as they're able to with streetcars and other forms of transportation. Obviously, noting again, there were those holdout neighborhoods such as Beacon Hill in Chicago. But for the most part, and I'm encouraging you again to look at figure 2.2 and table 2.1, you can see the elite were at the core with those with less status further out as one moved from the core of the city. and then how this began to change with industrialization and the development of industry at the core of the city, and everything around the CBD, or the Central Business District, became to be differentiated. And so we ended up in the 1930s with human ecology, or the Chicago School of Human Ecology, or the ecological models that showed that the city was like a living, breathing organism. And at the core was the Central Business District and industry, and then there were zones of transition, working class with the high income at the edge. Of course, this never went exactly like that because of a lake or a mountain or those holdout neighborhoods I referenced. But this was the sense that the city was a living, breathing organism and constantly changing. And as it did, the social geography of the city was sorted out as similar people, or like people, made similar decisions. And I'll just go through these quickly, but in time, with suburbanization, and we see this even within the Fraser Valley, the core of the city began to decline. People moved out, the households, manufacturing, eventually along the rail corridors as well, everything began to be to move into the suburbs, or suburbanization. And then that had an impact on the value of land. So the CBD was never the only peak area. In fact, in time, like Metrotown and so on began to develop as one moved further out of the city. So as one looks at the city during the industrialized period, and as one moved out, it wasn't straightforward concentric circles. There was often zones of higher rent that shifted out from the core, and where neighborhoods, as I already referenced, elite neighborhoods were managed to stay in the center. But with time, we saw suburbanization and some of the impacts on the city in terms of sprawl. That image I showed you with all the freeways and the turnpikes, this idea of suburban sprawl and the implications on the city due to the fact of this idea about urban form and what people valued in terms of where they wanted to live. So the industrial city could be seen almost as a spatial sandwich with ethnic pockets, family status, more families as one moved out of the city, certain areas of lower and high sector socioeconomic, all superimposed on the physical and natural space. And I encourage you to watch some of the Levittown YouTubes, because it's sort of your introduction to the classic industrial suburbanization model. So as we move forward into what your author refers to as contemporary city, or the post-industrial city, it's changing again, and if you will, almost inverting in terms of where the elite live. And again, nothing happens across the board, but for example, downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, the most expensive residential properties, again, are often found at the core of the city. And globalization and other concepts, other ideas about business and technology and online shopping is again restructuring the city, and we can only watch to see what the implications are that, for example, on large malls. So chapter 2 really worked you through the main characteristics of the pre-industrial city, looked at how the city is beginning to change in terms of the contemporary city, and I'm just encouraging you to keep working your way now with the Africville conversation, and I'll do a little bit more on that next week in terms of Africville, and then start talking about the culture of the city. But just to remind you that social geography is really the geography of human concerns in the city, and that as one begins to look at the city, and you don't need to do this as a group, obviously, but just begin to reflect on how the city's changing currently in terms of car share, Uber, for example, new forms of mass transit, migration, demographics, cultural, economic change, all topics that you can refer to or focus on in your virtual presentation. Have a great weekend.